The cold February wind of 1944 cut through to the bone as the first Soviet reconnaissance patrols reached the eastern bank of the Narva River. Before them lay a frozen gray strip of ice, beyond which rose the ancient walls of Herman Castle and Ivangorod Fortress, two stone giants that had gazed at each other for centuries in silent confrontation. At that moment, it seemed like just another water barrier on the path to the final liberation of territories. But the silence hanging over the snow-covered banks was deceptive. It concealed the beginning of one of the most protracted and methodical confrontations of that period, later to be called the Battle of European Volunteers, and a place where the offensive momentum of a huge front became bogged down for many months in swamps and granite rocks. This stretch of land, only a few tens of kilometers wide, turned into the neck of an hourglass, where time and resources melted away with frightening speed, and every meter of advance cost incredible effort and colossal resources. Behind the advancing units lay a completely deblockaded Leningrad, a city that had endured unthinkable trials and now yearned to push the line of contact as far west as possible. The strategic design of the High Command was crystal clear: to break through the enemy's defensive lines with a swift strike, reach operational space in Estonia, and thereby collapse the opponent's entire northern flank. It seemed that the inertia of the great victory near Leningrad and Novgorod would itself carry the troops to Tallinn. However, reality dictated different conditions. The geography of this region seemed specifically designed for defense. On one side, the boundless waters of the Gulf of Finland. On the other, the impassable shores of Lake Peipus. And between them, a narrow isthmus, at the center of which stood the ancient city. It was here that the enemy decided to give battle, using the natural features of the landscape to multiply the strength of their defensive lines. Preparation for the defense of this line was systematic and planned in advance. The Hitlerite leadership understood that the loss of Narva would open the gates to the Baltics, which would inevitably lead to political collapse in relations with allies in the northern region and deprive the fleet of operational freedom in the Gulf. Therefore, the Panther line was built here, a deeply echeloned system of fortifications saturated with concrete pillboxes, anti-tank ditches, and minefields. But the main factor was not technology, but people. By early February, specific formations representing a motley international composition had been transferred to this sector. Here were not only regular Wehrmacht units, but also volunteer units recruited from all over Europe: Norwegians, Danes, Dutch, and, to a significant extent, Estonian formations. For many of them, it was not just the defense of positions, but a matter of survival for their political ideals or the defense of their homeland, which created a volatile mixture of fanaticism and desperation. The Soviet command, in the person of Army General Leonid Govorov, saw the situation differently. After the successful lifting of the siege of Leningrad, the Second Shock Army, under the command of Ivan Fedyuninsky, received orders to force the river on the march and seize bridgeheads. The first attempts began in mid-February. The ice on the river was unreliable, and artillery preparation in the wooded and marshy terrain did not always achieve its goal, but the order demanded forward movement. Soldiers overcame the icy water, dug into the rocky soil on the western bank, creating tiny patches of land that immediately became targets for concentrated fire. The enemy's defensive strategy was based on instantaneous counterattacks. As soon as Soviet groups managed to gain a foothold, they were struck by reserves, which included heavy tanks and elite infantry units. The main external conflict unfolded over the possession of key communication nodes. The city of Narva became merely a geographical symbol, while the true struggle was for control over the railway and highway leading deep into Estonia. Soviet troops attempted to bypass the city from the south through the so-called Narva swamps in the Auver area. These were places where nature itself rebelled against man. Heavy equipment bogged down in the unfrozen mire, supplies were delivered along narrow corduroy roads that were constantly under fire. Every gun, every box of ammunition was brought to the front line at the cost of immense physical exertion. Nevertheless, by the end of February, a bridgehead south of the city was captured and held, which became a constant threat to the entire defending group. The opposing side, realizing the criticality of the situation in the Auver area, threw its best forces there. The command of Army Group North understood. If Soviet tanks broke out onto the Narva-Tallinn highway, the entire defense on the river would turn into a trap. During this period, units that would later become legends in certain circles began to appear on the battlefield: the Nordland Division and the Nederland Brigade. These were soldiers who had gone through the harsh school of the Eastern Front and possessed a high degree of tactical training. The interaction between their infantry and armored groups was honed to automatism. They used a tactic of mobile defense, where instead of holding every trench, they would retreat to a second line, call for artillery fire on the abandoned positions, and then counterattack. The internal, personal conflict of this battle lay in the plane of commanders' ambitions and responsibilities. General Fedyuninsky was under immense pressure from Stavka. He was demanded results in the shortest possible time, often disregarding the reality of logistics and the fatigue of personnel. This led to decisions that contemporaries and historians often call hasty. Attacks on the same fortified areas were carried out again and again, even when it became clear that a frontal assault was not bringing success. The Soviet soldier here showed true miracles of resilience, staying in icy trenches for weeks, eating dry rations, and daily going on the attack against concrete fortifications. On the other side of the barricades was Felix Steiner, commander of the 3rd Panzer Corps, an experienced and pragmatic military leader. His personal dilemma was that he had limited resources and could not afford to wage a war of attrition. Every lost soldier was irreplaceable for him, as reinforcements from Europe arrived extremely slowly. Steiner relied on the discipline and elite status of his units, creating a sense of belonging to a kind of special order of European defenders among his subordinates. This was a game on the edge, maintaining morale in conditions where the strategic initiative had completely passed to the enemy, and the front behind them was relentlessly shrinking. A special place in this internal conflict was occupied by the Estonian legionnaires. For them, the war took on the character of a deeply personal tragedy. On the one hand, they fought as part of units that were officially considered part of a criminal system. On the other hand, they believed that their participation would help restore Estonia's independence, or at least prevent the return of the old order. Many of them had relatives fighting on the other side of the front as part of the 8th Estonian Rifle Corps of the Red Army. On the banks of Narva, not just a battle of two world systems was taking place, but often a fratricidal struggle, where orders were given and calls for help were shouted in the same language. This psychological breakdown left its mark on everything that happened, making the resistance of the defenders particularly fierce, and the fury of the attackers extreme. The philosophical and ideological conflict of the Battle of Narva lay in the clash of two utopian ideas, each of which considered itself the only true path for humanity. The propaganda of the defenders actively promoted the slogan, protecting European civilization from Eastern hordes. In the trenches near Narva, one could hear Danish, Dutch, Swedish, and even French speech. For these people, Narva became a kind of new Stalingrad, but with the opposite sign. They tried to prove that international unity under the banners of certain ideas could stop superior power. The paradox was that they defended a regime that was itself the embodiment of inhumanity, while using arguments about freedom and culture. The Soviet idea, on the other hand, was based on the concept of a liberation mission. Soldiers saw not European volunteers, but an enemy who had brought untold suffering to their land. For them, Narva was just another obstacle on the path to the beast's lair. The clash of these two worldviews on a narrow strip of land created a situation where compromise was fundamentally impossible. The classic rules of military science about a 1-to-3 ratio of forces for attackers did not work here. Here, complete superiority or incredible cunning was required. However, there was little cunning in the spring battles of '44. Brute force and reciprocal tenacity prevailed. The turning point did not come as a result of one grand attack, but as a consequence of the gradual exhaustion of resources and a change in the overall front. In March 1944, Soviet aviation launched massive raids on Narva, turning the city into ruins. This was supposed to facilitate the assault, but in reality, it only created additional difficulties. Piles of bricks and stones became ideal positions for snipers and machine gunners. The city ceased to exist as an architectural object, becoming merely an exclusion zone where every basement was turned into a fortress. By summer, it became clear that the old tactics were not bearing fruit. The Soviet command decided to change the vector of pressure. In July 1944, an operation began that radically changed the situation. After a large-scale offensive in Belarus, the position of Army Group North became catastrophic. The threat of complete encirclement forced the German leadership to make the decision to withdraw from the city of Narva itself. This was not a flight. It was an organized and extremely brutal withdrawal to pre-prepared positions 10 kilometers to the west, to the Tannenberg Line. This line ran along 3 key heights, which went down in history as the Sinimai Hills: Lastakodu, Grenadari-Magi, and Torniemagi. It was here that the fate of the entire campaign in Estonia was to be decided. The shift of events to the Tannenberg Line became a moment of truth. The heights, rising above the flat, marshy plain, gave the defenders a full view and the ability to adjust artillery fire for many kilometers around. For the Soviet troops, the most difficult stage began. If before the obstacle was the river, now they had to climb open slopes under heavy fire. The culmination came in late July and early August 1944. The battle for these heights, in its intensity, surpassed everything these places had seen before. Hundreds of guns on both sides created a real firestorm. The air was so saturated with dust and smoke that day turned into twilight. On the slopes of Sinimai, units from various divisions mingled. The defenders used their last reserves, throwing staff officers, signalmen, and repairmen into battle. Soviet divisions in turn displayed incredible tenacity, capturing heights and holding them to the last man. Several times, the crests of the heights changed hands. This was a time when technology receded into the background, giving way to a direct clash of wills. Eyewitnesses recalled that the soil on the heights was literally plowed by shells to such an extent that not a single whole tree remained, and the earth itself turned into a mixture of sand and metal. Despite tactical successes in certain sectors, Soviet troops failed to break through the Tannenberg Line on the first try. The battle reached a stalemate that lasted until September. However, the strategic situation in Europe was not decided solely near Narva. The Red Army's successes in the south, reaching the borders of Germany, and the threat of intercepting communications in the Riga area made further retention of the Narva isthmus meaningless for the Wehrmacht. In mid-September, an order was given to evacuate all of Estonia. The defenders began a swift retreat, trying to avoid the cauldron that was already closing behind them. The resonance of these events echoes even today. The Battle of Narva has become the subject of numerous historical discussions and political speculations. For one side, it is an example of the heroic resistance of the European Brotherhood against superior force. For the other, it is a testament to the unwavering power and determination of a people who crushed the strongest enemy in their history. However, if one removes the ideological husk, what remains is the harsh truth about human endurance and the tragedy of choice. Narva showed that even the most perfect defense is powerless before global strategic processes, and stubbornness without flexibility leads only to a senseless waste of lives. The lessons of Narva teach us that geography and fortifications are merely tools, and the outcome of any confrontation is decided comprehensively. Soviet command ultimately drew conclusions from the bloody treading in place, moving to more mobile and well-thought-out operations in the Baltics. For us today, it is important to understand that behind the dry lines of reports about divisional losses lie the fates of hundreds of thousands of people who became hostages of grand politics and the clash of two irreconcilable worlds. This battle became a symbol of how a narrow strip of land can accumulate the tension of an entire continent. Concluding this narrative, we once again return to the banks of the Narva River. Today, silence reigns there. The river still carries its waters to the bay, and Hermann's Castle and Ivangorod Fortress still gaze at each other. But if one looks closely at the surrounding landscape, at the forest-covered hills of Sinimai, one can see traces of those events, scars on the earth that have not healed even decades later. The soldier who looked at the river in February 44 could hardly have imagined that his personal path would become part of such a large-scale and contradictory chronicle. Narva remained in history not only as a place of military confrontation, but also as an eternal reminder of the price that must be paid for every step along a path that seems to be the only correct one. This narrative is not just a recitation of facts, but an attempt to look into the very essence of human confrontation. The history of Narva teaches us that even in the most dead-end situations, time finds a way out, often through pain and transformation. And though the casualty figures and operation dates remain in textbooks, the living memory of those days continues to live in the stones of fortresses and the sound of the wind over the river, which was once the boundary between life and infinity. Narva of 44 remains a monument to an era where personal bravery clashed with the soulless machine of war, and faith in ideas was tested for strength in icy swamps and on fiery heights. Today, looking at the calm waters separating the two banks, we understand that true victory lies not in seizing heights, but in the ability to learn from the past so that such pages are never repeated. Every detail of this battle, from the first shot in February to the last rearguard action in September, forms a single picture of human drama, the scale of which is hard to overestimate. And in this continuous movement of history, Narva will forever remain a place where not just armies clashed, but the very foundations of human existence, leaving us the right to reflect and the duty to remember the price of every day lived under a peaceful sky. Returning to the opening scene, we see the ice on the river beginning to melt. This is a natural process of seasonal change, which in 44 became the backdrop for the greatest tension of forces. Nature is indifferent to human disputes. It absorbs the traces of battles, covering them with layers of new life. But our understanding of the past is precisely that bridge that connects us with those who stood on these banks. The Battle of Narva is over. Its participants have passed into history, but the echo of their steps is still heard in every word of this story, urging us to value peace and strive for understanding that is above any political ambitions and borders. The events of that spring and summer remind us of the fragility of human civilization and how easily a flourishing land can be turned into an exclusion zone. Narva became a lesson in tactics for some and a symbol of resilience for others, but for all of us, it should become a lesson in humanism. History is not only a chronology of victories and defeats, it is primarily an exploration of the human soul in extreme conditions. And if we can feel the weight carried on their shoulders by soldiers on both sides of the front, then their sacrifice was not entirely in vain, for it awakens in us a striving for awareness and responsibility for the future. With this, we conclude our journey through the roads of the Narva operation. It was a time of great illusions and terrible revelations, a time when steel was cheaper than human life. But it is precisely in such moments that the true qualities of a person are revealed. May the memory of those days serve as a reliable compass for us in the modern world, helping to distinguish the momentary from the eternal and false slogans from genuine values. The Narva River continues its flow, connecting the past with the present, and in this endless movement lies the hope that humanity will someday learn to resolve its disputes not by the force of weapons, but by the power of reason and compassion. Ultimately, each of us is a guardian of this history. We are the ones who give voice to those who fell silent forever on the slopes of Sinimai or in the swamps of Auvergne. Our attention to detail, our striving for objectivity, and our empathy for human fate are the best tribute to those who went through the hell of 1944. And may this text become another brick in the wall of our common memory, protecting the world from oblivion and the repetition of tragic mistakes of the past.